Introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm not,
You're fine.
okay. Greetings, everybody. Those that are here and those that are in Zoom land. I am Jeff Balls, president of the Horicon Marsh Bird Club. And tonight, we are fortunate enough to give Tom Prestby. Tom's been a staple in the Wisconsin birding community for, I hate to say decades already because he's so young, but he started out pretty young. And I did just see, did you just get 300 species in Brown County?
Yeah, the roseate spoonbill last year was actually my 300th in Brown County, so that was fun because it was the first county I've ever hit 300 in.
I mean, yeah, 300 in the state of Wisconsin is pretty amazing. Just locally, we've been Tom and I've been kind of chatting here and things. We've got a little bit of spring happenings. We got lots of Canada geese are back. There's some white-fronted geese been spotted in the area, sandhill cranes, a few red-winged blackbirds. Anybody else here from the audience have anything new? Nothing. Rivers are mainly open, mostly open. Lakes are still pretty much frozen, and that's kind of typical this time of year. Everybody kind of says, oh, when's it going to happen? I says, wait for the next south wind, because the next south wind is going to bring something. It's either going to bring more geese, a bigger variety of ducks, and all those type of things. Eagles, bald eagles are starting. We had a pair of bald eagles mating right outside the education center here the other day. So that was kind of fun to watch. A lot of active nests around. We'll be doing our Eagle Adventure here, bus tour coming on Saturday. We will have a early waterfowl trip coming up. I think it's third Sunday in March. Stay tuned for the newsletter. So you'll be getting that, and I'll be posting some things on Whisperbird as well when our field trips are.
Nest box seminar.
Yep. So March 2nd, first Saturday in March, we're having our annual Nest Box seminar. If you're interested, so we cover basically cavity nesting birds. We're going to have talks on wood ducks and bluebirds, which we have every year, and then we kind of rotate through another species. And this year it's going to be the American kestrel, and we're fortunate to have the Central Wisconsin Kestrel Research Project. Amber Eschenbach is going to be telling us about what we can do for American kestrels. We're going to have nest boxes for sale here at the center. I'll be talking on wood ducks. Pat Reedy will be talking on bluebirds. And so bring your nest box questions or nesting questions, or what you can do to help birds in your yard property area. Bring those questions here on Saturday, March 2nd. So it starts, doors open up, I believe, at 8 or 8:30, and it will go to about 12:30. So with that, any questions from the audience? Okay. So with that, I think we're going to let Tom tell us about bird conservation in Wisconsin and Cat Island. Tom is presently in Green Bay, grew up in Waukesha area, right? Waukesha County.
Close to their Wauwatosa, so just on the Milwaukee side of the line there.
So got his start in birds at a Wild Birds Unlimited? Is that, was it a spark, or was you into that before you started working there?
I was into birding for sure before then, so I thought that would be a really fun job, which it was.
So yeah, it just like you and Eric Brunke.
Yeah, I was with Eric Brunke and Tim Hahn and Paula Stitch. We all worked together on the same crew. It was
Yeah.
what they call the good old days for sure.
Yeah, it's amazing. So Tim is now officer with the WSO. Eric is now leading tours, bird tours worldwide, basically.
Yeah.
And Tom is doing some outstanding bird research right here in state of Wisconsin. So with that, Tom, take her away.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeff. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending either on Zoom or in person there. And it's awesome to be able to talk to you guys. I have a ton of awesome memories of Horicon Marsh, the Horicon Marsh Festival, all that stuff from when I was growing up in the Milwaukee area. And then I went to undergrad at Madison before ending up where I am today in Green Bay. Still get down to Horicon as much as I can, not as much as I'd like to, but usually a couple times a year. But yeah, I'm going to be talking today about some projects that we're working on at Audubon Great Lakes throughout the state of Wisconsin. And then I'll be winding up talking about all the birds that we've detected out at Cat Island in Green Bay on one of our projects, because there's always, I know it's always a big tease because I'm e-birding all sorts of really cool and a lot of birds out there, and it's not open to the public, but it's really fun to talk about it. And I will be able to share some good news that there are a couple of field trips later this year out there. But anyway, let's see here. All right, there we go. So I always start by explaining Audubon Great Lakes because it's a little confusing. We've got the National Audubon Society, and then we have 13 or so chapters in Wisconsin. But Audubon Great Lakes, you can kind of think of it as like a regional branch of the National Audubon Society. We have staff in those states there. We actually do have staff in New York State as well. But yeah, we focus on restoration projects, monitoring projects. Those are probably the main things, but we have a whole policy team as well. So we have people whose job it is to be in the different state houses in this region to fight for conservation bills, awareness, advocacy, things like that. So, yeah, there's quite a bit going on as I will detail. And, yeah, uh, the Great Lakes region is obviously an extremely important region. I'll be hitting on all of these things today, but the main strategic priorities are climate, coastal areas, and that's not just your Atlantic, Pacific Ocean, and Gulf of Mexico. We view the Great Lakes as a true coast, bird-friendly communities, working lands, and obviously water. Um, yeah, like I was describing before, lots of different ways from researching and monitoring to habitat restoration and preservation to getting out on field trips with community advocacy. And then, like I said, having action and awareness where laws are created and made. As I said, we've got about a dozen, 13 or so chapters in Wisconsin. Some are more active than others. I'm on the board for the Northeast Wisconsin chapter up here. And I'll be talking a little bit about how we work with them on a couple of our projects up in the Green Bay area. But I'm going to kind of frame why why we pick the projects that we do and go into a few very depressing slides here, but don't worry, I will lift the mood back up. You've all probably heard the things I'm about to say, but unfortunately, it is true that in the last 50 years, we've literally lost about 3 billion birds from the landscape. Just a totally staggering number. Really, really sad losses, not sustainable losses at all. So Audubon's big mission is, we always say that we're trying to bend the bird curve, because when you talk about the bird curve, it's this very alarming downward trend that we see in a lot of populations in the last few decades. And grassland birds have been hit particularly hard. I'll talk about our flagship grassland program in Wisconsin in a minute here. We've lost about half of the grassland birds from the landscape, and some of our iconic species like meadowlarks, we've lost probably about 75% of them. So if you think there's not as many meadowlarks, bobolinks, birds like that as you drive around the countryside these days as there used to be, you're absolutely right. Migratory birds, some of our favorite species. One of my favorites, the Baltimore Oriole. Again, you're probably right if you're noticing that you're not getting quite as many on your oranges or your jelly in May than you used to, or you're not hearing as many in the summer as you used to. Not only habitat loss, but you've probably all heard about how a lot of these neotropical migrants face the gauntlet while they're migrating of window strikes, communication tower strikes, all those things as well. So just a ton of hazards out there for birds like that. Aerial insectivores. These kind of, I feel like sometimes these get a little more ignored than they should. I know, at least for me, when I'm e-birding, I get to the swallows and I'm like, oh man, I totally tune that out. I don't know how many tree swallows or barn swallows to e-bird. I know I saw them, but I'm not really sure how many I saw. Well, they are definitely in trouble too, because they rely on all sorts of species of insects that have declined because of loss of native plants, increased use of pesticides, and several other things. So I think this might be my last downer slide before I build us back up. But climate change is also obviously happening. I mean, I know we have a strong El Nino this winter, which is accounting for this bizarre winter, but when you start stacking warm winter on top of warm winter, you start to wonder what's going on. And there's almost 400 species of birds in North America that are projected to change in one way or another due to climate change in the next several decades. And just a couple examples here. And again, this is modeled. This is worst case scenario. I think this is 3 degrees Celsius of warming, so about 7 degrees or something like that when you do the conversion. But this dark red here you see is current range that is not projected to be suitable for these species under those scenarios. So we're talking about bobolink, which is obviously an iconic bird of the countryside. And loon, you don't get much more iconic than loons in the North Woods. And how sad would it be to not have loons in our North Woods as a breeding bird? So just some of the alarming things that are possibly slowly happening, and we're trying to do as much as we can to not only understand what's going on, but figure out how to try to stem that tide. And first thing I'm going to talk about, the first project that I'll talk about tonight. I talked about grassland birds, how we've lost half of them from the landscape in the last 50 years. And I talked about how working lands is one of the pillars that Audubon Great Lakes really wants to be working in. And this is what we call Audubon conservation ranching, where we realize that, yeah, it's awesome to have protected land, whether it's state land, like some of those awesome grasslands up by the Bud Cook hiking trails. Um, Up north of Horicon Marsh there's some really good grassland. But there's not a lot of protected grassland out there. A lot of our grass is privately owned, and a lot of our grass has cattle or other animals on it. So what we want to do, which we've been doing out west for about 7, 8 years now, is working with farmers, ranchers, whatever term you want to use, to develop grassland bird friendly protocols for their grazing. And this has really taken off out west. Obviously, it's a little easier out west because the ranches are much bigger than a lot of areas or all areas that are grazed here in Wisconsin, where out there, a few hundred acres is a pretty small parcel, where here a few hundred acres is a very large parcel. But that's okay because you can get meadowlarks, you can get bobolinks on a 40 or on a 80, especially if there's open landscape or ideally grass in the area. So you can see there we have our first pilot Audubon Conservation Ranch there in the Dodgeville area. But we're launching this in Wisconsin and Minnesota, getting a lot of interest. And basically what we're going to be doing is we work with the landowner to come together with them, write up a habitat management plan for their land that meets their goals as a landowner and as somebody who is selling products from beef cattle, and grassland birds goals. And those grassland bird goals are also going to make the water cleaner, make the soil healthier, store carbon better, and um this is kind of what we envision here, where, yeah, obviously sometimes it's really hard to rotationally graze. You might think of a lot of pastures as being a lot more grazed over than this, but when somebody has the flexibility to do that and it's done in the right way, that can actually be a really good way to maintain habitats for birds like meadowlarks, like bobolinks, like grasshopper sparrows, because it holds back succession. Cattle keep the brush back. It's obviously a lot less intense than row crop, like excuse me, corn or soybean fields. There's a lot less erosion coming off of an area like this than a bare corn or soybean field. Um, and the cattle mimic what the bison did hundreds and hundreds of years ago on this same land. And the grassland birds evolved with bison out on the landscape. So lots of things can be done with rotational grazing. And I should mention this too, but you might be wondering what's in it for the farmer, other than obviously having a healthier landscape and having these birds on their land. But that seal that I showed, I'll go back a couple slides here. That seal, they get to put that on all of their products. So any beef that they sell is going to have this seal on it. And we think that and hope that Audubon is a big enough household name that people will think bird conservation when they see that seal and choose that meat over other meat, whether it's on a restaurant menu or at the grocery store. And meat from these places is becoming more and more common in grocery stores, and we're hoping that that'll continue to be the case as we get this launched in the upper Midwest. We also, one of the fun things here is we do bird monitoring on these ranches. So we want to track how these grassland birds respond to improvements that are made out on these ranches. We put it into something called the Bird Friendliness Index. So that measures not only what species are there, but how many of the species are there, and what is the conservation of that species, the conservation status of that species. So if there's something that's a lot rarer, like a upland sandpiper or a Henslow sparrow, that bird friendliness index is going to go way up, because basically you're getting more points for having that rare of a species out there. And I do want to plug too, we're going to be doing monitoring at several of our farms this upcoming June. Some of the farms are not too far away from where a lot of you live. We have some in Jefferson County. I think we may even have a couple in Dodge County. I'll have to check on that, but I know we have several in Jefferson County. So if anybody wants to volunteer to do some grassland bird surveys in some of these pastures, we would be more than happy to have volunteers do this monitoring. It's really fun monitoring. It's a really fun way to get out and see an area that you normally wouldn't be able to bird. And some of these places do have grassland birds on them, but even the places that don't, it's really important to document what's there so we can compare it to what shows up after a couple years of improvements. And speaking of that, just a couple examples of that. We've had some really, really good response from some of these birds out west, where the grassland bird abundance has increased by 36% at our first 35 Audubon Conservation certified ranches. There's a ranch in Wyoming where grassland birds increased 180%. And then in Missouri, I know we don't have a lot of bobwhite here in Wisconsin, but a 5-fold increase in bobwhite and a 6-fold increase in eastern meadowlarks after what they did on that ranch, where their main habitat management plans were to do patch burn grazing. So basically doing controlled burns in some areas. And then it's really cool, actually. They say that you don't even need fences, because the animals will actually go graze where the new grass is coming up after a burn. So if you burn in different areas, it can move the animals around just naturally as they follow that. And yeah, that the big thing there was getting rid of fescue for more native plants. So just a couple of examples of how that has really helped already out west. And again, if you're interested in helping us monitor this year, that would be awesome. But we're hoping you'll be hearing more and more about Audubon conservation ranching in the state in the next couple of years, because the program's starting to take off and we're really excited about it. I'm going to switch gears now out of the grasslands and go to Great Lakes coastal wetlands for the rest of the night, because that is Audubon Great Lakes' main strategic priority. These are wetlands that are either on the Great Lakes or connected to the Great Lakes within like a few miles, connected by a river or a stream or something, as long as the water goes directly into one of the Great Lakes. And why are we focusing on that? They obviously provide critical resources, not just to birds, but to people. Wetlands store water from flooding. They clean water. They prevent erosion. But from a bird standpoint, they also host rare species. They host a lot of species, and not just rare species, but waterfowl that people love to watch and then love to hunt in fall, generate huge recreation. That depends on wetlands. So there's a lot riding on these Great Lakes wetlands. And unfortunately, over the last few decades, and this is no coincidence, definitely corresponds with those bird losses that I was detailing earlier. Um, the Great Lakes coastal wetlands have faced a lot of challenges and a lot of setbacks, like contamination, pollution, erosion, invasive species. If you come and drive up by my area, uh, you can't even you can't even open your eye for a second without seeing phragmites lining the ditches. Invasive cattail is obviously all over the place. So yeah, there's a lot of degradation that has happened to the wetlands. Um, but a lot of partners have been doing a lot of great work in these really important Great Lakes coastal wetlands, and there's a lot of momentum right now, which is very, very encouraging. So what we do is to basically measure the health of these wetlands, we use marsh birds like this Virginia rail, something that obviously Horicon Marsh Bird Club would know more than probably any other bird club about the birds I'm about to talk about, since Horicon Marsh is such a great spot for them. But we use rails, bitterns, swamp sparrows, pied-billed grebes, black terns, gallinules, those kinds of species as our indicators, because they need good habitat. If the water quality starts to decrease, if the vegetation structure or the vegetation type starts to deteriorate, you will notice by a drop in these species. And if those things start to get better, you will usually notice by an increase in these species. So we try to monitor these species before restoration happens, after restoration happens, because it's a good way to measure how birds are reacting and measure how that wetland health is. And our flagship project in Wisconsin is up in the Duluth Superior area. I'm going to get to Green Bay in a few minutes here. But yeah, Green Bay and the St. Louis River estuary, which is up by the tip of Lake Superior there, are our two real main focal areas for where we want to be putting as much resources as we can into studying and protecting these Great Lakes coastal wetlands. So a quick description of what we're doing up in the Duluth Superior area. If you've ever been to Wisconsin Point for that Jagerfest field trip in September, or for it's a great place to go to pretty much any time of year, maybe not January or February, but it's I'm talking about that big marsh that's on the other side of the road as Lake Superior. There's a big bay out there with a big marsh, and that used to have a ton of breeding, black terns, rails, bitterns. It was a really, really healthy marsh. Unfortunately, Superior, like so many other industrial Great Lakes cities and ports, dealt with a ton of pollution, a ton of disturbance, and the wetlands there have suffered as a result of it. So we're working with more than 15 partners. We've done bird surveys there the last couple of years. And our restoration there is informed by those bird surveys, also by climate adaptation strategies. I'll talk about what that means in a second here. But our goals are basically to enhance native species, to build hemi-marsh, to protect the high quality wetland that's still there, and then build off of that to do restorations elsewhere in the St. Louis River estuary. when I talk about hemi marsh, you guys in a lot of parts of Horicon have some of the best hemi marsh of anywhere in not just the state, but the whole Midwest and probably the whole intercontinent. But I'm talking about that middle picture there where there's a lot of species that use habitat on the left there. That's very nice habitat too. That's a big sedge meadow there. Sedge wrens, Virginia rails, American bitterns, maybe if you're really lucky, a yellow rail will use that habitat. And then on the right there, that's really important too. Those impoundments that egrets, grebes, all sorts of ducks use with quite a bit of open water. But what we've really lost a lot of, and what some of these birds, like least bitterns, yellow-headed blackbirds, pied-billed grebes, really key in on, is what we call hemi marsh, which is like a 50-50 mix of patches of vegetation and patches of water. And it's a hard habitat to maintain, but when it's there, the birds really love it. And that's what we are trying to restore in Aloise Bay there. On the left there, that's what a lot of that marsh looks like. Basically, you're looking at a wall of invasive cattail with some Phragmites mixed in. That's kind of what the leading shield of the marsh looks like, and that goes back in for a few hundred meters. But you do get into areas that still have excellent habitat, like what you see on the right-hand side here, where this is an area where they're seeding wild rice. And this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say hemi marsh, where we've got pockets of water, pockets of vegetation, really nice diversity in the structure. And that is going to support a lot of species of birds and wildlife. So the last slide on this project, and I know that text is small. Don't worry about that at all. This is just a real general overview of what's going on there. And it's that southeast corner of the bay there where we're doing this work, where that large wetland is. But you can see there's been a planning effort to do all sorts of other things out there too. And this isn't just restoring wetland habitat. This is things like increasing access to residents who live in that neighborhood on the south side there. This is increasing piping plover habitat on the north there. They use sandy dredge material to try to attract them. They've had a couple migrants so far. They have not nested there yet, but we're hoping that they do soon because the habitat is definitely there. And I said I would explain what climate resilience meant earlier. And basically what I'm talking about there is this wetland here, which is where we are doing this work. Part of the reason it's in worse condition is because when a northwest wind gets howling out there, a lot of energy comes in and basically bashes this wetland after it gains energy over the base. So one of the things that's being proposed, we're looking several years out, but is to possibly use some dredge material to create some islands or shoals, things like that out here. And that'll create direct habitat for shorebirds. That'll make even more waterfowl habitat out there, but it'll also slow down that wave energy, which we're thinking will really benefit this wetland as well. And as we get stronger storms with higher winds and more unpredictable precip and wind from these storm events, that's why the climate resiliency is really important to be thinking about when you're doing these wetland restorations. And you'll notice a theme when I talk about Cat Island in a little bit too. But yeah, I'm going to move up to my area now in Green Bay and talk about Oneida for a minute before Cat Island. This is another really fun project that we have going on with the help of volunteers. So if you live closer to Green Bay, or if you want to take a little drive north occasionally and help with surveys, we are always looking for more volunteers. And again, you get access to awesome habitat that normally you would not have access to because this is tribal property. But it's a partnership between Audubon Great Lakes, the Oneida Nation, our regional chapter of the Northeast Wisconsin Audubon chapter, and UW Green Bay. And basically, there were several hundred acres that were restored from soybean and barley to grassland and wetland. And this only happened a few years ago, but we've been monitoring the grassland birds, the marsh birds, the waterfowl, and the shorebirds ever since. And we've really been documenting an awesome response. We've counted over 6,000 different individual birds. We've had more than 80 species of birds. And I mean, none of this is like forested habitat. So that's all wetland, grassland, shorebirds, stuff like that. We've had cool birds out there like white-faced ibis, redneck phalarope, Hudsonian godwit. We had a pair of eared grebes that I was really hoping might try to nest, but they stayed for a few days and then migrated like they usually do. But I think my favorite thing, and any of you duck hunters, I know Jeff will love hearing this, but last year I did a count out at one of these restored wetlands, and I literally counted 1,300 pintails. And seeing a flock of pintail like that in Wisconsin literally sent chills up my spine. It was so cool to see that many pintails on an area that was literally an agricultural field 5 years ago. So again, yeah, we're working with Oneida to document what's using these areas. We can always use more volunteers. And there's been a really awesome cultural exchange too between Oneida and the Audubon chapter and other volunteers, where we've had tribal elders tell stories and all sorts of different Oneida stories and legends, and just really cool. They have a whole alphabet that has different words for a lot of the birds that we're familiar with. Their creation story features a hermit thrush and a bald eagle. So just fascinating stuff, and it's so fun to sit down and listen to those stories. So I'm going to talk about Cat Island now for the rest of the night. And this is also in Lower Green Bay. I should have said earlier with Oneida, if you're not familiar, the Oneida Nation is about 10 miles or so southwest and west of the city of Green Bay. So that's where that is. But yeah, so piping plovers. You've probably all heard that we have nesting piping plovers at Cat Island, and they have bred there since 2016. This is one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken, even though it's not one of the best pictures in terms of clarity or zoom or anything like that. But I always love this picture because if you look right here, right by the bird's foot here, what you see there is a piping plover egg sticking out of the sand. And I just took that picture because that female was acting weird. And then it was when I zoomed in on my LCD screen and I saw that egg, that was the first time we had ever confirmed piping plover breeding anywhere in Lower Green Bay. And it was the first time anywhere on Green Bay, so between Green Bay and Escanaba, Michigan, in the last 75 years that they had tried to nest. So really cool that they're there. And what we do at Audubon is we partner with Fish and Wildlife Service to monitor the piping plover population every year. So that goes from getting out there in April as adults return and set up territories. Last year we had tied for our earliest nest ever anywhere in the Great Lakes for piping plovers. We found a nest on, I think it was April 26th. Usually they start nesting the first half of May. Like May 7th, May 8th is like our average date for a first nest. So April 26th, pretty early, and that pair suffered the consequences. They had to incubate their eggs through uh snow on May 1st, where we had like 3 or 4 inches. But they did it successfully. They raised chicks. So that was fascinating. There's always fascinating stuff that happens out there, and that monitoring is really important to document that. Last year we had a chick about the size of the chick in this picture that had a cocklebur stuck to the pad on its foot, and that bird would not have survived if our monitor did not see that, communicate it immediately. We got a team of about 4 or 5 people out there later that afternoon, including someone from Fish and Wildlife Service who had a permit to ban piping plovers. And basically we surrounded the chick. Thankfully, it wasn't old enough to fly yet. We were able to catch it. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff was able to safely remove that cocklebur. I mean, you know how nasty those are if they've been stuck to your socks or your shoes before. Imagine if you were the size of a ping pong ball and one of those was stuck to you. That bird was limping badly. But then ever since that cocklebur was removed, the next few hours and days of monitoring basically documented that that bird was fine. It was never seen limping again. It went right back to its parents, and that bird ended up fledging successfully last year. So a direct result of monitoring, because I really don't think that bird would have ever been able to get rid of that cocklebur or survive. So yeah, or yeah, I'm going to talk about the history of Cat Island in a second here, but yeah, we monitor plovers every year, and that monitoring data is extremely important because this is one of 2 sites in Wisconsin, the Apostle Islands being the other, where plovers breed every year now. And that monitoring really helps apply adaptive management. So what I mean by that is managing the habitat accordingly. Sometimes we have vegetation that really skyrockets in June and July, and we need a crew to get out there to try to abate that. Issues like the cocklebur, where something comes up, a predation issue that we have to try to respond to. So really, really important, and you see a lot of fun stuff, and hopefully they will continue to succeed out there. Not the only bird out at Cat Island by any means. I was talking before about how a lot of our coastal wetlands on the Great Lakes have been lost, and Green Bay is a fantastic example of that. This is what the Cat Island chain and the Atkinson Marsh, this is the Duck Creek Delta, if you're familiar, used to look like in Green Bay. This is an aerial from 1938. You see basically an extremely dynamic marsh, a really big freshwater marsh where this creek comes out. This is being protected by these islands. So exactly what I was talking about up in Eloise Bay, where when we get strong storms with a northeast flow, that comes in, and now that these islands have eroded, this is the aerial in 2010, I think this was, and look how those islands are gone, and now that wetland, which used to be halfway out to the island chain, is basically gone. A lot of that happened after that island chain eroded because now waves with whitecaps can get all the way to that wetland, and a lot of plants that are keystone wetland plants in Great Lakes coastal wetlands just cannot survive that type of energy. So this is what Cat Island looked like before the start of the project. And then in 2015, the project was started where we always call this the main spine, this kind of squiggly road that goes out there. It's a gravel road. It actually follows the old footprint of that island chain. But what you see here is there's three different, they're going to be islands that are made with dredge material. So it's a win-win scenario to recreate this wildlife habitat, at least recreate it the best we can, and use the next 30 plus years of dredge material from the shipping channel of Green Bay, which goes from the mouth of the Fox River all the way up into the bay, right past the end of this structure. They need a place to put dredge material, and this is a win-win for putting that material and restoring wildlife habitat. And I always get the question, is this clean material? Because a lot of dredge material is not, especially in a place with the legacy of pollution or the vulnerability to runoff that Green Bay has. And yes, so the sediment is all tested. And usually, as a rule of thumb, like the first mile out from the Fox River is assumed to not be clean dredge. So that goes to a different facility. We call it the Bayport facility in Green Bay. And it's the dredge material from about here out, where if it's tested below a certain parts per billion measurement, that is allowed to go to Cat Island. So what you see here is the first year of dredge, which that is a beautiful white sand beach, basically. And we got extremely lucky because you might remember birding back at the Milwaukee Coast Guard impoundment back in the day, or maybe the Manitowoc impoundment. And dredge material usually does not look like that. It's a lot siltier, muddier. And we do get a lot of that material, but they first hit sand, and that sand is what immediately attracted piping plovers, and they've been there ever since. At Cat Island, we've detected more than, I think we're right at 250 species, which is pretty impressive for a place that basically doesn't have any trees. It's a top 10 site if you look at the eBird hotspots for number of species in Wisconsin, and it's only been a site for about 10 years. But this is a typical site out there, and I talked about that other dredge material. Well, there's a lot of birds that use that too, when it's exposed or when there's really shallow water on top of it. This is always a fun picture. We've got dowitchers, we've got semi-palmated Bairds, white rump sandpipers, and their stilt sandpipers. Really, really fun migratory flock of shorebirds. And that is a somewhat characteristic site out there using that other muddy dredge material. And we've documented 30 species of just shorebirds out there in 2022. I think last year we had 31, if I remember right. I think we've had a total of 36 shorebird species out there, which is really high. Being the birder that I am, the ones that I'm really hoping for that we have not had yet are rough. I still think we could get a snowy plover out there someday. Hasn't happened yet. We've had western sandpiper, we've had red phalarope. So we've had some of those rare shorebirds, but yeah, I'm always hoping for that next one. But high concentrations we've had too. Really nice numbers of Dunlin, semi-palmated sandpiper, birds like that, and some really fun birds like flocks of a dozen godwits. I mean, seeing that in Wisconsin is just so fun. And also it's one of the best migratory stopover locations in the whole Western Great Lakes, actually, for red knots. I once on Memorial Day saw a group of 23 red knots out there, which is pretty much an unheard of number in Wisconsin or anywhere in the Western Great Lakes. But every year we do get a few red knots in May, and then more of them, usually juveniles, in August and September. So that is a federally listed bird as well, just like piping plover is. So a really important stopover location for a lot of these species plus red knot. And yeah, there's talking about the red knot a little bit more. And we do have other species besides piping plover that breed out there that are really special. Wilson's phalaropes. This is an awesome picture because it shows their reverse mating system. There's a female that's actually chasing a couple of males in this picture. And they've nested out there every year since 2018. We see chicks out there. They do these circular flights over our heads when they're grunting, basically distraction displays. And that's been a successful nesting site for them. And I think in the whole breeding bird atlas, there were only 5 or 6 confirmations of Wilson's phalarope in the state over a 5-year period. So that shows you how uncommon of a nester they are in Wisconsin. Terns, very important too. For them, it's one of the only places in Wisconsin where common terns nest. It's one of the only places where Caspian terns nest, and you may have heard about how a couple of years ago, unfortunately, Caspian terns were absolutely devastated by avian flu up off of Door County on some of the islands where they nest up there. So now Cat Island has actually become the biggest population of breeding Caspian terns in Wisconsin, and a really, really important source population as we try to hopefully recolonize those islands to the north that were battered by avian flu. Forster's tern is nested out there. Now they nest naturally in the wetlands near Cat Island. We've documented Arctic tern out there. Black tern stops by. It used to nest in Lower Green Bay, and we're hoping that it will nest again before too long, but we're going to need more wetland restoration to make that happen. Waterbirds, that's another really fun thing, is in spring and even fall, you can see thousands of ducks, hundreds of mergansers, grebes, all sorts of birds keying in on this habitat. It's cool because you remember that aerial of the wave barrier, and if you have a day with really strong south winds, a lot of the waterfall will be just on the north side of that barrier. And a day with really strong north winds, a lot of the waterfall will be just on the south side. But sometimes that whole area between Cat Island and Kenures and Duck Creek is basically full of dabbling ducks and diving ducks. Probably will be in about a month and a half, something like that. They usually peak in late March and early April. So yeah, we're hoping that things are returning to the way that they used to be in Green Bay with some of these restoration efforts, because Green Bay used to be absolutely phenomenal location for breeding and migratory waterfowl and marsh birds. Waterbirds aren't the only species that are attracted to Cat Island. We get the highest snowy owl numbers in the state during their fall migration. Usually it's right before typical freeze up happens, which I say typical freeze up because usually it's mid-December, but this year it didn't even freeze out there until the middle of January. But we've had about 15 snowy owls out there at a time before, and basically they're migrating down Green Bay. They see an area that reminds them of the tundra, and they're not, since it's not publicly accessible, they're not getting disturbed. So it's very, very ideal. They have ducks to hunt at night. There's small mammals out there now too. The voles and mice and stuff have found it. So tons of food out there for them. Um, Sometimes one or two of them will stay, but usually they all leave as soon as freeze up happens, which tells you that they're probably hunting the waterfowl. Um, Longspurs, pipits, hornlarks, snow buntings, very, very common sights out there. Short-eared owls stop by every spring and fall. Nelson sparrows, Lacan sparrows, sometimes we're lucky enough to see them on some of the native vegetation that will pop up in late summer and fall as they migrate through the state. So yeah, that I know that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what we have going on in Wisconsin. That's not even everything. But it's everything I can talk about in an hour. Um, there's a lot of ways that people can help out. I always say the best thing you can do is participate in community science, which is eBird, the Christmas bird count. I think it's this weekend. We have the Great Backyard Bird Count coming up. So a big plug for that. All you have to do is eBird and you're automatically contributing into the Great Backyard Bird Count. Being an advocate for birds and their habitats, obviously being at Horicon Marsh, you have an awesome opportunity to do that. People are coming to Horicon Marsh. There's a lot of people who come there who are not hardcore birders just because of how cool of a spot it is. And then they can learn about all the really cool birds when they come there. Joining conservation organizations, things like that. Obviously, um, obviously sometimes just a small impact is a big impact too, like planting native species in your yard. That was the thing I didn't talk a ton about tonight was the bird friendly communities, but more and more, I'm sure you hear this a lot too, but we're realizing that having native plants is so important, especially in landscapes like neighborhoods and yards where a lot of people just have turf grass to be able to support native insects, including butterflies, and then birds that eat some of those insects and also use the seeds and the nectars from those plants or the berries or cover from the shrubs or even the nuts from the trees. Just really, really, really important. And that's one of the easiest things you can do is try to convert at least part of your yard to natives. So yeah, lots of stuff out there. And by being in the Horicon Marsh Bird Club, obviously you're off to an awesome start. And yeah, I like ending with this slide because it's totally true. You spent your Thursday night at a bird talk, so obviously you're interested in birds and bird conservation, and thank you so much for that. You truly are what hope looks like to a bird. And yeah, I gave a lot of sad and downright angering statistics earlier, but there is hope out there. Audubon and ton of our partners, bird clubs like the Horicon Marsh Bird Club and so many other groups in the state and nationally are really doing a lot and making a difference. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'd be more than happy to stick around to answer questions or anything like that if anybody has any. Thank you.
So we'll take any questions, type them in the chat at first, and then we'll take those. So Tom O'Malley says, does the Great Lakes Audubon work with conservancies in the 5 states. They seem like a natural partner for your program.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely work with conservancies on in a few different ways. We'll team up with conservancies to do bird surveys on their property. Sometimes if there's land to possibly acquire, we'll work with conservancies to try to do that and help them out with that because Audubon Great Lakes is not in a position to buy or acquire land, but that's something that sometimes conservancies can do. So that can be an ideal fit sometimes. But yeah, having as many partners on restoration projects as possible is always great. So we work with conservancy partners if they have wetlands on their property or near where the conservancy is that they're interested in trying to do restoration at. Definitely more than willing to help either plan out that restoration or any other any other roles where Audubon might be um needed or wanted to come in.
Just comment from Sarah. This is great information. Thank you so much. Rick wants to know, are you going to drop the Audubon name?
That's a really good question. So you've probably heard a lot in the news lately about the whole Audubon name. And if you haven't, that goes back to John James Audubon. In the last couple years, National Audubon has been doing a lot of research and soul searching because it was found that he owned slaves long after that was not a normal thing anymore. And several other things that I won't get into that you could easily look up. But the answer to your question, the National Audubon Board voted last summer to keep the Audubon name because it's such a household name and they think the marketing power is so important. That was the decision of the board. People who are way above me and my staff. However, a lot of regional chapters are changing their name and they completely have the right to do that. The Madison chapter has just changed their name to the Southern Wisconsin Bird Alliance. I think Chicago is changing to Chicago Bird Alliance. Our Northeast Wisconsin chapter is going to be the Northeast Wisconsin Bird Alliance now. And all of those chapters will still be Audubon chapters and have that relationship with Audubon. They just won't carry the Audubon name anymore because they don't feel comfortable doing it. So a little bit complicated and a little bit murky because different levels are doing different things and some chapters are keeping the name, some aren't. It's a fluid situation, which is probably still not ironed out yet, but that's where we are right now.
Okay, comment from Liz. There again, she's helping up our native plant sale that's coming up in May 18th, I believe. You can do your pre-orders now. So
Awesome.
there again, plant your backyard, even just a couple of specimen plants, out of that whole landscape. If you look at it from above, even in a city landscape, you can, especially older neighborhoods, you can pick out those trees, those mature trees, and now you can add and enhance that with smaller vegetation, with bushes and berries and shrubs and perennials and all that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, yeah. Please buy plants from that sale. And I'm sure Jeff, Liz, other birders here, Carl, I saw is on, could echo me when I say that when I do Christmas bird counts, when I did point counts for the Atlas, and you're in residential areas, it is no coincidence that you'll be driving around slowly. You'll find a flock of birds somewhere, and a lot of times that's because that yard has taller vegetation. They let part of their yard grow. They grew a wildflower garden. They put native shrubs in. They did something like that or some combination of that, and the birds respond. More birds will nest there, and a lot of times more birds will winter there as well, and you'll get more migrants. So you really do see those results quickly, and I find it quite fun and addicting to plant native plants too. I get into it and I always want more and more.
Yeah, it's fun, and it's fun to learn. Fun to
Yeah,
learn. So,
absolutely.
question from Jane: How big is Cat Island now, and what's the long-term goal? I know that you had mentioned the possibility for multiple islands there, and
Yeah, very good question. So, I'm gonna go back quick to one of the slides so I can kind of point it out. Um, let's see here. I'm getting close. Okay. So, the goal is, so eventually, and when I say eventually, I'm talking about like 30 years down the road. And this is an older picture. Now some more of this and a bunch of this is actually filled in, and then a bunch of this is filled in. But we still have room for at least 25 or so more years of dredge material. This is going to be an island. This is going to be an island, and this is going to be an island. These two areas here, there are culverts there, so water can get through. And the original plan was for those to get those segments of the road to get knocked out to make them true islands again. There's been talk about adding additional culverts instead and keeping that road there for maintenance reasons. So we'll see what they actually end up doing. When I say they, I'm talking about mainly the Army Corps of Engineers. They are the property owner, as they are with other dredge facilities. But yeah, it's an active construction site every year. And the plan is, I mean, they're with that piping plover habitat, they're keeping that available. They're not going to be covering that sand with other stuff because of how important that's been for that federally endangered species. But with these other spots, they kind of build out and they build up a little bit. So, it part of it looks nasty right now because it's all purple loosestrife and stuff like that, but then they pour more dredge material on top of it the following year. But the plan long term is for it to be wildlife habitat, so there will be habitat management occurring on it once things are done or once any specific area is done. And like I said, in that piping plover area, we do a lot of management because the vegetation tries to come up on that sand. We obviously don't want it to for the plover's sake. So they do a lot of disking out there in the spring. They do a little bit of herbiciding. They tried to do a controlled burn this winter. It was a little too humid. And we had a thick frost the night before. But they're still going to try to do that sometime before the plovers get back in the next 2 months or so. So yeah, lots of different things going on. But yeah, the long-term plan is for those three cells, as we call them, to become islands. And yeah, they'll be large islands, but the slope is very gradual. So we're hoping there's always going to be some kind of an interplay for shorebird habitat. And I'm glad this got brought back up, Cat Island, because I forgot to mention that. So there will be two opportunities to get out there this year. I always lead a NRF trip out there in mid-August during peak shorebird migration. So I think NRF has their registration starting like in March or April, but I will also be leading a WSO trip out there. We haven't had WSO out there in several years, but I'll be able to take a WSO group out there. I think it's the last Saturday in August, or it's the 24th. And then the NRF trip is on the 17th. So if you haven't seen Cat Island and you want to, um, one of those two trips would be a fantastic opportunity to do so.
Okay, somebody, um, you mentioned the monitors to help protect against predators. What type of predators are an issue at Cat Island?
Excellent question. So there's a whole litany of predators out there. The bird predators out there, peregrine falcon is probably our most common. We've never watched a peregrine catch a plover, but we've seen one get really close, and we suspect that it's happened while we haven't had people out there before. Um, Great horned owls do occasionally come from these trees that you see in the corner here. This is Barkhausen Wildlife Area, if you're familiar with the area. So not too far for a great horn to fly. They're more of a problem with the common tern colony than they are with the piping plovers. We had last year our first documentation of a grackle eating piping plover eggs. Um, yeah, it was surprising. Although if you watch grackles, especially in June when they're feeding their young, they will put large things in their bills. So wasn't completely stunned, but that was surprising. And it was actually the first grackle predation on piping plovers with photographic evidence. So we're actually writing up a paper on that. But another really interesting one is a couple years ago, the DNR biologists found a color band from a piping plover in a snowy owl pellet. Yeah, we had snowy owls coming back through in April, and there were a couple birds lingering there in April and May. And again, one of those things where we never saw the owls harassing the plover during the day, but sure enough, the my friend who's the DNR biologist watched one cough up a pellet and went to go check the contents of a pellet, and lo and behold, there was an orange piping plover band in the pellet. So yeah. Crows are a big problem at a lot of sites with plovers. Not a ton at Cat Island because it's enough out into the water. Merlin is the biggest piping plover predator in Michigan. Thankfully, that has not been a predator at Cat Island for plovers yet. They'll show up and they'll hunt the migratory shorebirds, but I think those big flocks catch their attention better than the plovers do. And then the other really big avian predator is gulls, particularly herring gulls. We have big nesting colonies of ring-billed gulls and herring gulls out there, and you can see when herring gulls are on the prowl in the piping plover nest area. Usually they're down by the shore or up by their colonies. Their colonies basically are up here in the areas, or I'm on the wrong screen, sorry, are up in the area, those other couple of cells, but a few birds will make it into the piping plover cell. And yeah, our monitors are trained to actively scare gulls, falcons, crows, birds like that away, if they are acting like they're hunting. And that's just the bird predators. There are mink out there, and anyone who knows the personality of a mink knows that a mink is tons of trouble for anything smaller than it. That ravaged the common tern colony and the piping plover colony. I think it was 3 years ago. And then USDA actively removes raccoons and possums from the site because they have been known to be piping plovers elsewhere, and they are removed when they're detected. So the likelihood of them taking piping plovers is lower. So yeah, lots of different predators. And yeah, usually a new one or two gets added every year.
So another question was, can I use a scope? Is there any place nearby where you can scope Cat Island?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately, no. You can walk up to, I think the gate is right here, but the way the land is, you can't really see this over this big berm here. You can scope from 10 years actually, about a mile and a half out there. So like you could see something large like a snowy owl or something like that out there. But in terms of identifying shorebirds, that would be pretty much impossible. It is legal to take a boat, but I always recommend against that. If you do, you're not allowed to get out on the sand or on the structure at all. And you need to be extremely careful because there's a lot of dredge material under the water, and it's basically like soup and quicksand. So if you were to try to step out, you could get stuck really, really easily, or you could get your boat stuck. So staying out here, you can see some of this stuff with binocs. But the best way to birdwatch out there is definitely to attend one of those field trips in August.
Oops, let me get back here to the chat. So Amy asked a question, how is Kinnear's project connected to this project? And do you know why they cut the cottonwood trees on this property?
Yep, really good question. That project's not officially connected to this project. However, in terms of how a bird thinks, it is connected because here I'm gonna try to find, there we go. Good, it was only one slide away. So Ken Years is this right here. And I don't know if my cursor is working or not, but if it's not, it's the lower left-hand corner of this picture. So those trees were on this dike and this dike, and basically they needed to rebuild that berm. That dike was failing because of the roots of those big cottonwoods. And so they had to get rid of those cottonwoods to rebuild the dike. And now they're going to be able to control the water level in there to maximize habitat for birds like shorebirds and marsh birds, to be able to rise water and drop water like they do at a bunch of the impoundments at Horicon to try to keep invasive species at bay. And even though it took away some habitat for warblers and other birds like that that use those trees, that actually made the habitat a lot better for shorebirds, marsh birds, birds like that, because now, and we've already noticed that, but a lot of shorebirds will fly back and forth from Cat Island to Ken Years and back. And normally those trees, that's a pretty big barrier for shorebirds because they know that predators come with that. And it's just a physical barrier in their sight line. And ever since those trees were removed, we've noticed a lot more shuffling between the locations from these shorebird flocks that will stop by in migration. So yeah, it's definitely harder to find the warblers and stuff like that now, but overall, for a lot of birds, that was a big habitat improvement.
All right, let's get back to the chat here if there's any more. Rick had one here before. Rick had mentioned there is a healthy soil, healthy water of Dodge County that people can contact as well. for those that are in the Dodge County area. So it was interesting you mentioned that grazing,
Oh,
course,
yeah.
early with the grasslands. So we have neighbors that have probably close to 300 acres
Okay.
converted into a grass-fed beef operation.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is our go-to spot for bobolinks and
Yeah.
And
it-
big sissels.
and dick sissels when they're
Yeah.
in the area. So it is one of the few places that I can still go in Dodge County that I can count on meadowlarks.
Yeah.
Are getting very tough to find. I can go
Exactly.
to many places and find bobolinks, but meadowlarks like a really short, sparse grass where bobolinks tolerate a little bit thicker, older, heavier grass.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, and I may contact you and see if you'd be I don't know, be interested in one of those monitoring spots or
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, I mean, it's definitely grazing and pastures are very important because they still have grass. Um, Obviously, sometimes there's a lot of animals in there and not a lot of space, so there's not much habitat, but something like 300 acres can be very important to grassland birds, and especially when you compare it to corn or soybeans, which is pretty much everywhere else, which doesn't support any of those birds at all, or hay fields where some birds can maybe get an early clutch off, but unfortunately, a lot of birds like bobolinks will try to nest in a hayfield and then lose their nests and their young when the hay is cut. And that's part of the thing we do too, is we'll work with a lot of people who graze beef cattle also have hay fields. So we'll work with them. And we know that you're going to take a hit on earnings and all that if you hay late. So basically what we try to do with people is just set aside like some refuge areas or a certain percent of your hay fields to mow after July 15th or something like that. Because that can really, really help some of these birds out. And like Jeff said, if an area has land and is rotational grazing, that can be awesome for meadowlarks and bobolink because yeah, maybe a nest here and there will get stepped on or the grass around it will get chewed enough where it'll be vulnerable to a predator, but a lot of nests do make it in that situation a lot more than in a harvested hayfield or something like that.
it's interesting. I have 40 acres in CRP adjacent to
Okay,
and it was planted in the dense nesting cover, which is primarily big blue stem.
sure.
I rarely get any bobolinks and never any meadowlarks,
Okay, yeah,
but I'll get sedge wrens and some other things, nesting waterfowl, turkeys and
yeah.
those
Have you
type.
ever had Henslows in there?
No,
Okay,
not that I've been able to confirm.
sure. Okay. Yeah. And they're a tough one for grazing too, because Henslows, as some of you know, need that residual layer, that thick kind of understory, even though we're talking about grass, so to get them in a grazing situation, you basically need people to keep a pasture idle for a year or two, which is tough for a lot of people to do, but that's Henslow's is kind of on the other end of the spectrum as meadowlarks or hornlarks, birds like that that like the shorter grass.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've learned. Not all grass is equal.
No, absolutely.
And it's like, not all trees are equal. And so
Right.
it's and it was eye-opening to me. Um, and it's one of those things you learn through birding, like, oh yeah, I can see that, short, sparse grasses, meadowlarks, the heavy duff, for the Henslows, the really wet thing, heavier stuff for
Yeah,
trends, all that stuff. So,
exactly. Yeah.
so anybody else have any questions for Tom? We got one here from the audience.
Rick asked a question that I didn't hear you ask him. Is there a possibility of a bird club tour with Tom? I got it.
So, it's been asked, is there a possibility for a bird club trip to Cat Island? Or is that we have to get special permission, or how does that?
Yeah, so to have a trip out there, I always have to get it. There's a voting committee with all the different partners that vote on like different events, and it has to get voted on like before, I think it's before January 1st, the start of the calendar year. Um, and there has to be a leader who's experienced with the site, so that's why I lead most of the or all of the bird trips out there. So I know for this year, it probably wouldn't be possible, especially they usually don't like me leading more than about 2 trips out there because I always shoot for August because they don't let any trips out there while plovers or other young terns, birds like that are still breeding because that's a disturbance. And then usually the dredging operations start in September, and that's when waterfowl hunting starts out there with the early teal seasons and stuff like that. So there's that little window there in August where I always do an NRF trip, and then I usually try to do some other trip. And this year I'm doing WSO. But it's possible that in a future year we could do a Horicon Marsh Bird Club trip out there. But for now, I would say keep an eye on your social media, or I'm sure Jeff will relay it to the club once the word of the WSO trip in particular comes out. Because yeah, we're gonna try to get a bunch of people out on that, and Tom Schultz, Jeff Bauman will be helping me lead it, so we'll be able to bring quite a few people out there.
Just a quick question myself. Isn't there a waterfowl refuge on Lower Green Bay or certain areas?
Yeah, so the impoundments in Kenures are a refuge. People hunt all the time, like out here on the actual bay, but these impoundments are a refuge. Just north of this map here, there's Sensiba State Wildlife Area, which is a fantastic place. That's a refuge too. That's where we had 2 limpkins spend a couple months last fall. We had a Eurasian widgeon last fall. Um, always, always a great place to bird. So there are a couple different refuges. Green Bay gets quite a bit of hunting pressure, but I mean, even in areas where people are hunting, there's still a lot of birds around because there's just so many birds that come through. But yeah, there's scattered refuges, even farther north or farther north, Oconto Marsh, the actual impoundments in Oconto Marsh, that's a refuge as well. So yeah.
I know there's a Green Bay Duck Hunters Club there that's real active
Yeah.
in propose, that area and try to help restore it and bring back, waterfowl populations
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, they've been an awesome partner on a lot of these restoration projects for sure.
So, anyone else? Any questions? With that, I want to thank you. Thanks, Tom. Let me know if you ever get down Horicon Way. I'll,
Absolutely.
what little I know and what's being seen. And, any target species they can help out with, but
Absolutely. Yeah. I always try to get down there at least a couple times a year, but yeah, I I'll definitely try to get down there sometime during spring migration. Are you aware, do you know, question for you now. Um any I know some of it might be decided later once you see what water levels and stuff are like after the winter, but are you aware of any drawdowns that are going to be occurring this spring, or is that not set
Not
yet?
on the state end that I'm aware of yet.
Okay.
Some of
Okay.
that may happen in conjunction with some other maintenance that could happen,
Sure.
either late this year or in 25.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
suppose the north half, that's all federally
I'm
operated.
not privileged to that, and I'm sure they always try to do something.
Yeah.
But last year was drought conditions, so we, Mother Nature says we're having a drawdown, we're having a drawdown.
Uh-huh.
So that's
Yep.
the
And
there.
if we don't get a lot more snow and rain here in the next couple of months, we might not shake that drought.
Yeah, I know a couple weeks ago, I was like, okay, it's finally kind of back to normal water levels. And then,
Uh-huh.
we didn't have any precipitation, and it was right back down to,
Yeah.
late summer stages again. And
Yeah.
that's
Not good.
the good news on that is a lot of the areas that were dry these past, 2 summers, or, especially this last summer. In my case, were Small Creek. It all came back in a buried,
Oh,
which
nice.
just
That's great.
fabulous. So,
Yeah.
folks, don't be discouraged. You're like, oh, the water's all gone. There's no bird habitat. It's being replenished. It's being refreshed.
Yeah.
And we've got a great example of that. We did on one of our poundments this last summer, and now we just reflooded it. And now that's one of the spots where we got white-fronted geese hanging out. So
Nice.
really
That's
looking forward to
fantastic.
that, because that was just a ton of Bidens and bulrushes in there last fall. And so they did a burn on the cattails and reflooding. So I suspect that is going to get lots of really heavy use of waterfall this spring.
That's awesome. Awesome.
So with that, I want to thank everybody. Thanks again. Next month, we are going to have a presentation on red knots. And it has kind of a local connection. One of our club members from Waupun,
Henry Larson.
her daughter is studying red knots in Alaska.
Mhm.
So we're going to have that presentation from Alaska. So that's one thing with the Zoom. We've been able to expand our speakers, US wide, continent wide. So it's been a real blessing that way. So
I might have to tune in for that one. That sounds fantastic.
yeah. So thanks again for everybody. Thanks again, Tom. We'll be in touch. All right.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.